Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hebrew-Keevering, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. I also wanted to introduce my co-coordinators, Mabel Baldwin-Schaefer, if you can wave Mabel, and Story Oates, because they'll be helping me behind the scenes today, and we'll also be trading off moderating future webinars, so I wanted us all to get familiar with each other's faces. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska, our partners in the communities we work with, and how we connect with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. This school year, we're presenting short series of webinars that are more regionally based so that we can focus on topics of interest to those regions of Alaska. We're aiming to present perspectives from the communities we work with, as well as research conducted by students, in addition to established scientists. We hope this gives you a look at different communities as well as different career paths you might be interested in. We're starting our webinar series with a presentation of a study on St. Lawrence Island, or Sivujaq, and we'll be moving to a series of webinars on the Northwest Arctic in February. Today, we're introducing you to Janelle Larson-Temple, who works for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Juneau, Alaska, and Tonya Osborne, who is a Caleb Scholar Program alumnus and Alaska Native artist. While we'll be talking about NOAA's and partners' role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we're all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that Janelle and Tonya's work for Janelle's walrus study was done on Sivujaq, or St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, the traditional lands of the Siberian Yupik, who have stewarded their lands and waters for thousands of years. We're indebted to their wisdom and knowledge of their lands and waters. Janelle and Tonya would like to acknowledge the traditional first people of Juneau, Alaska, the Tlingit. We respectfully acknowledge the Occoquan Tlingit people as the original owners and inhabitants of the Juneau area, and thank you also to the Taquaquan Tlingit people whose ancestral homeland surrounds the Taku River and the southern area of Douglas Island, which today is part of the city and borough of Juneau. We would also like to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, including the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speakers. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure that everyone can hear our speakers. However, there's a box where you can write questions and we encourage you to ask them as we go. My colleagues Story and Mabel and our two interns Elizabeth and Emma and I will be keeping track for Janelle and Tonya behind the scenes. They'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We may not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, I'll hand it over to Janelle and Tonya to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Janelle Larson-Temple and I'd like to introduce my colleague Tonya Osborne.
Hi everyone, my name is Tonya Osborne.
Hi, I'm Janelle Larson-Temple and the two of us will be presenting to you today. We're going to share with you 3 different research projects, and these were all part of my PhD at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I was a student there. And first, we're going to talk about the reproductive biology of Pacific walruses, and specifically what ovaries can tell us about how female walruses respond to changes in their environment. Second, we'll talk about subsistence, and we'll learn about how the loss of sea ice has impacted people that are living on St. Lawrence Island. And lastly, we'll talk about how these projects contributed to a collaborative project working with the schools to update their Yupik curriculum. But before we dive into all that, Tony and I thought it would be nice to share a little bit about ourselves and how we became interested in our career paths. I'm originally from landlocked Wisconsin, but when I was only a few months old, my family relocated to Massachusetts and lived on the coast for about 6 years before moving back to the Midwest. And I think that was a really informative time for me. I spent a lot of time, oops, what happened there? I spent a lot of time going to the beach and playing in the waves. My parents took us duck hunting and fishing, and I really developed a love for the ocean. I knew I was always interested in being a marine biologist, Of course, the terminology changed over time. I thought I wanted to be a dolphin trainer when I was young. And then when I was in high school, I took a course in AP psychology, and I was interested in studying the cognitive abilities of animals, or how animals think and learn. When I was in college, I went to Jacksonville University in Florida, and I found an even better fit there. I volunteered for a professor doing a study on bottlenose dolphins, and I spent a lot of time doing photo identification. So I would take photographs of the dorsal fins of individual dolphins, and I spent a lot of time on boats and kayaks. And I just loved spending time outside. It was really apparent to my professor, and she asked if I had ever considered a career as a wildlife biologist. And that really lit a spark in me, and I switched my focus from wanting to study animals in zoos and aquariums to wanting to study wild populations. While I was in college, I pursued several different internships and research opportunities. I spent a summer in Seward, Alaska, where I did a maternal investment study on Steller sea lions. So we learned about how Steller sea lions raised their young and the different strategies they used. I spent 2 summers in Maine. I was a research assistant there, and I assisted a woman working on her PhD studying the distribution of large whales in the Gulf of Maine. And so all these different experiences led me to pursue a career working in marine biology. And I ended up enrolling in a graduate program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I started studying walruses. After I finished my PhD research, I took a job with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as their endangered species biologist. I have a very diverse position. I currently work on everything from bumblebees to belugas to shorebirds. And I feel like some days I am a true field biologist, and other days I feel more like a librarian or even an investigative journalist, as I spend time tracking down information on rare and declining species, and that information is used to make management and conservation decisions. I'll turn it over to Tonya, and she can tell you a little bit about herself.
Hey everyone, my name is Tonya and my Nup'ik name is Kananak. I grew up in the native village of White Mountain, located in western Alaska, but our family eventually moved to Nome, which is also located in western Alaska. Being surrounded by the ocean and having a strong cultural connection with marine mammals really inspired me to further my education in marine biology. My dad is also a lifelong commercial fisherman, so he would bring home like different animals to eat, like crabs and snails. So being really fascinated with that kind of stuff from a young age. And our family and village depended heavily on marine mammals as a source of food. Marine mammals are also greatly respected and honored in my culture. They've given themselves for food and for our people and have allowed us to survive in the harsh Arctic for millennia. You can go to the next slide. My family encouraged me to participate in summer programs like the Alaska Native Science and Engineering Program, also known as ANSEP, where I received a lot of support to go into the STEM field and take on really hard college courses when I was first starting to go to school. I decided I wanted to go to the University of Alaska Southeast, located in Juneau, and I eventually graduated with my bachelor's in marine biology in 2019. And being an undergrad was probably like one of the most fun years of ever going to school, because I started getting really interested in doing research. I learned about REUs, also known as Research Experience for Undergraduates. I applied for this one program at Mystic Aquarium in Connecticut, where I was able to do beluga research, collect blow samples from their aquarium belugas, and then travel all the way back up to the North Slope, like in Point Lay, And after all of that, that was the summer internship. And after I came back to UAS in Juneau, I really wanted to continue doing research, and that's how I met Janelle. I applied for another research program called BLAST URE, undergraduate research experience. And it's a research experience that connects undergraduates with graduate students, what Janelle was doing when she was doing her PhD work. So that's how we got connected. You can go to the next slide. And after graduation, I really tried to get a job really quick, and I started working in STEM education at Sealaska Heritage Institute here in Juneau. I did that for 1.5 years until I decided I wanted to run my business full time. While I was working there, I also met a really amazing Tlingit carver mentor who taught me how to carve walrus ivory and bowhead baleen. So as of May 2021, I started making jewelry to sell. Sorry, that's my dog. Making jewelry to sell out of subsistence harvested marine mammal products like walrus ivory and baleen. I also use other products too that I can get my hands on. Next slide. Okay, does anyone have any questions for me or Janelle?
Okay, so if you have any questions for Janelle or Tonya, you can put them in, you can type them into the chat box that you see down at the bottom, or the question box actually that you see at the bottom of your control panel. It might be on the right-hand side of your screen, or it might be on a different area, depending on whether you're on a laptop or a tablet. And one of the questions that we did have is for Tonya, what was your favorite experience as a research undergraduate?
I think my favorite part, this was a really specific and weird experience when I went to the aquarium at Mystic Aquarium. Like growing up around marine mammals, working with their fur and eating their meat, they have a particular smell. And some people, they don't like the smell, but a lot of Alaska Natives, they'll start drooling when they smell it. And when I started working at the aquarium, it was really weird because you'd go to the seal section and then you'd start smelling the seals. You're like, damn, that smells like food. And then you start working with the belugas and you're like, damn, I've never seen a living one, which was a really funny experience. And then, but also being able to bring that back out into the field when we went to the North Slope, just seeing the really big differences connecting, I guess, our Western science world with Indigenous people. And I guess combining those experiences together was something I'll never forget.
That's very interesting. I really appreciate your view of combining both the type of science that you were doing as a research undergraduate with the life that you grew up with, and the knowledge that you gained from going out and subsistence hunting and the traditions of your family. So thank you. Janelle, I have a question for you. And after that, I have one more question for Tonya. But Janelle, one of the questions was, what was the favorite part of your work when you were doing your work, your PhD work?
My favorite part was definitely working with folks in the communities. I loved working with the hunters. So we went out and asked for people that we knew were already hunting if they'd be willing to contribute to a biosampling effort and if they would collect ovaries for the studies that we were doing. And so I would go around on the back of a snow machine or an ATV with a community member and knock on boat captains' doors and ask them if they would be willing to sample ovaries. And those were some really fun conversations Some of the captains were already knowledgeable about ovaries and they had collected them in the past for studies that were done decades ago. But there were younger folks too, which had no idea what they would look like or where they were located. And I would show them diagrams and talk about why it was important. And so that was a really fun experience that I had in the field.
Great, and we'll be hearing a little bit more about that as we go on. Thank you. So Tanya, we had a question from Mrs. Marcus's kindergarten class. They wanted to know how you make the jewelry. And I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but if you could just give you a brief answer on some of the ways that you make jewelry, that would be great.
Yeah, so I don't do it the way our ancestors do. I have power tools like a bandsaw and a belt sander. I don't know if they would know what that is, but it's like an electric saw. And it's a really stinky job. I have to wear a mask and I have to cover my eyes, and I'm thinking about getting a hair bonnet because it stinks up my hair too. But yeah, a lot of cutting and sanding, and then to get it polished and really beautiful, there's a lot of hand sanding, using sandpaper of different grit sizes, like so just making the surface of the ivory as smooth as possible, and then polishing it up with a buffing machine. I don't know how much they'll understand, but it's a really stinky job, really dusty.
Sounds like it's a lot of work, but the pieces that you showed were beautiful. Well, I know that we have a lot to cover, so maybe we should go on to the next section, and we'll hold on to questions until after that.
Sounds good. So we mentioned that the work we're sharing with you today was all done on St. Lawrence Island. And St. Lawrence Island is located in the middle of the Bering Sea, between Alaska and Russia. There's two communities there, Gambell and Sabunga, and we worked with community members in both locations. And you can see on this map that Gambell is actually very close to Jakarta, or part of Russia. It's only about 38 miles away. And so historically, a lot of folks would travel back and forth on skin boats between these two places. So keep that in mind when we talk about the language program. And then the other thing that I want to share with you is a video of my time spent on St. Lawrence Island. And this will give you a perspective of what it's like there in the springtime.
All right, here we are in Gambell. It is May 14th, 2016. And I just got in maybe an hour ago, but for fear of this being the only gorgeous day that I'll be here for this full week, I thought I might capture a video. That whale must have been recently harvested. It's rotting and kind of stinky. Probably about, I don't know, 5:15 p.m. right now. And it's just gorgeous. It's probably nearly almost 50 degrees. It is May 15th, a beautiful late morning here in Gambell on St. Lawrence Island. And it's in the 40s, sunny, and I'm sitting here on the edge of town. It's May 17th, 2016, here on the shores of Gambell. Seen some gray whales feeding this morning. Sunny, probably high 30s here. Got some big rollers kind of crashing in on the beach. Some jellies being brought up. It's nothing quite like warming up the Bering Sea in May. It's the 18th, 2016. Sitting here. is.
So this is a gray whale, and in the springtime, hundreds of gray whales will come up to St. Lawrence Island and feed right offshore. And then here you're viewing a seabird colony. So up in these rocky ledges, different species of auklets and murres will come and nest. And egg collecting is also an important part of the subsistence culture of St. Lawrence Island.
Alright, today is Tuesday, April 12th, 2016.
Here it can be quite windy
On
in the
St.
middle
Lawrence
of the
Island.
Bering Sea here.
What you're seeing right now is the Bering Sea, and I'm here as part of a little fieldwork component, participating and talking with all the hunters that are helping out in the biosampling effort.
Are you guys able to see my presentation again?
So I think you have to share your screen, Janelle. Yeah, there you go. And then you can put it back to presenter view. There we go.
Great. So that's just a little taste of what it's like in the springtime on St. Lawrence Island. During this talk, we're going to use the word subsistence a lot, and I wanted to talk about what subsistence is. It's more than just hunting. So subsistence for Alaska Native communities does include the harvesting of animals, but it also includes things like collecting berries, preparing food for your family, sharing a meal together, and it includes using all the parts of the animal for things historically like making boots, making rain gear that they would wear, so clothing, and even things like using the hides of walruses for making skin boats and even making homes and dwellings historically. So subsistence is more than just consuming parts of animals for food. It's parts of things that are necessary for life and have been historically, and also art. So subsistence is a really all-encompassing term. Another term for that is traditional uses. We'll be using that throughout our talk. So let's talk about walruses. That's what I studied during my PhD. Walruses are pinnipeds. Other pinnipeds you might be familiar with are seals and sea lions. And so there's a picture of a female walrus and her calf on the right. And then there's another pinniped, a young harbor seal on the left. And I was really interested in walruses because they're very different than a lot of other pinnipeds. So for instance, they have a 15-month gestation period. And a gestation period is the amount of time for pregnancy. So you might know in humans, it's about 9 months. In most seals and sea lions, it's about 12 months or a full year. But for walruses, it's extraordinarily long, it's 15 months. Additionally, walruses are interesting because they undergo an annual migration, and we don't see that in many other seals or sea lions. So this map is going to show you where they migrate. I'm going to highlight St. Lawrence Island in that blue box, and then Juneau is that star on the right side, and that's where both Tonya and I live and are presenting. For walruses, they spend their winter months in the area shaded in pink in the Bering Sea. And so usually this is all locked in with sea ice, but walruses can actually create holes to breathe up through the ice, and they'll hang out in what's called polynyas or breaks in the sea ice. And so during the winter months, the males and females and all their young will congregate together. And then in the springtime, as that sea ice breaks up, the females and their dependent young will actually ride up on ice floes into the Chukchi Sea. And that takes them to these really rich feeding grounds where they feed on clams. Meanwhile, most of the adult males will go to coastal haulouts. And the word haulout just means a place where the walruses can rest. It could be land or it could be sea ice. So walruses will actually travel hundreds of miles just in a single year. So this is that migration. And then reproduction. I mentioned that they are pregnant for 15 months, and that's a long time. So for them, mating occurs sometime between December and March. And then they give birth to a calf, which can be as big as 140 pounds at birth. And that happens the following spring. So sometime between April and June, with most calves born in May. My first question for my research was, were walrus reproductive events the same across time, or were there time periods in which females were able to give birth to calves more frequently? We're going to be talking about ovaries. Those are the reproductive organs in walruses. And to give you an idea of where those are located, I put this red arrow in here to show you on this female where you could likely find her ovaries. This is what a walrus ovary looks like. It's about the size of a chicken egg. And so when a female produces an egg to be ovulated, if she's ovulating, it actually creates a scar inside of her ovaries. And this is a scar that you can see with your naked eye, and you can actually feel it. It's a little bump, a little scar tissue with your fingers. And so we actually looked for scars within walrus ovaries over time to understand how many times she could possibly get pregnant. And so here's 3 ovaries. We looked at ovaries from a span of about 40 years, and we had samples from the 1970s, the 90s, and then the early 2000s. And you can see that these ovaries were sliced, much like a loaf of bread. They're connected at the base, but then all these little slices allow us to page through each flap, just like you would a page in a book, and it would allow us to see how many scars that female had over her lifetime. So these scars from ovulation last a long time, and they can help us determine how many times that female was able to get pregnant. So when we dissected them, this is what it looks like on the inside, and I'm going to point out some of those scars. So here's a big one from recent ovulation. There's a second one right next to it, and then you can see there's a white one right there. So there are 3 different scars indicating this female had 3 ovulations. Let's revisit this picture. And these ovaries are in slightly different positions. You'll see the one from 1975 is laying on its side. But do you guys notice any differences in the size of ovaries between these 3?
So for everybody in the audience, if you have any observations about the difference between the size of the ovaries from the 1970s and the 1990s and the 2000s, if you want to type that into the chat box, into the question box, then we can get what you guys see out of the picture that you're seeing on the slide now. So we are getting some folks that are typing in here. Alice and Paul are saying that the 1990s are bigger. There's somebody else that says it looks like the 2000s are less wrinkly, although I don't know whether that has to do with the way that they're preserved. And there's some talk about how the 1970s are about half the size of the 1990s. So what were your conclusions from that, Janelle?
Yeah, those are correct. The ones from the 1970s tended to be quite a bit smaller from the 90s. And actually the ones from the early 2000s timeframe were also smaller than the 90s. So you guys are spot on. That was the trend that we saw across time. Interesting note about the wrinkliness from the 90s. That's likely due to the way that the ovaries were stored. They were put in preservatives in jars, and if they were crammed, their shape could have gotten a little bit wrinkled up. So any guesses onto, well, first I'll tell you what that also means. So the ovaries were smaller in the 70s and in the early 2000s than in the 90s. And we also noticed that they had less scars from ovulations. That's less times that that female was able to produce a calf. Do you guys have any guesses on why that might be?
So for those of you in the audience, why do you think that walruses might have had fewer calves, fewer babies in the 1970s and the 2000s as compared to the 1990s? Are there any guesses to why that might be? So Jasper is saying that maybe there was more food when the ovaries are bigger in the 1990s. So maybe the availability of food has something to do with it. We have pretty smart people in our audience, I think, because Miriam is also saying food supply. Renee is asking whether maybe it had to do with hunting regulations. There's also some talk about whether maybe the weather was colder. Natalie is saying more walruses might have been hunted, so there were less males maybe to mate with the females. And we have some questions coming up. So first of all, before we get to the questions, what was your take on why there was this size difference?
Yeah, you guys are onto something here. We've got some future scientists among us. And so someone mentioned something about hunting restrictions, and walruses were actually commercially hunted for a while. And in the late 1960s, they put a ban on commercial hunting. Actually, I think it was the early 60s. And so a lot more walruses were around. And because of this ban on hunting, many walruses meant that there was less food. And so the population was thought to be reaching its carrying capacity. And that means that there were more animals than the environment could support. And so we noticed this by working with scientists and from scientists going to Alaska Native communities. When hunters would harvest a walrus and cut open the stomachs, they saw that clams were getting smaller and smaller across time. So that meant that they were eating all of those large, tasty, available clams and were just left with smaller and less abundant food resources. So that was a great job on sleuthing that answer out. People also noticed at the time in the 70s that there were these really large herds of walruses falling out in new locations where they hadn't been recorded in recent times. And then what happened in the 90s was that the population started to reach a balance with its environment. And so there weren't as many animals, they weren't over that carrying capacity. And so they were able to produce calves more frequently again. The 2000s was kind of a tricky one. We didn't see those same indicators of the population reaching carrying capacity that we saw in the 70s. We didn't notice clams in their stomach getting smaller. But what we do know is that 2007 was a really poor year for sea ice. And so what happened was during the springtime, females and their young couldn't ride on those ice floes and travel up to the Chukchi. They either had to swim all the way to get there, or they had to go and use terrestrial or land haulouts. And so it's likely that that impacted their body condition and affected their ability to reproduce in the following years. And now, Lisa, I'll take some of those questions if folks have them.
Okay, so Lori was wondering, does the scarring on the ovaries occur in all female marine mammals or just pinnipeds, so walruses and seals, or is it just relevant to walruses?
That's a great question. That scarring occurs across mammals. It happens in seals, it happens in whales, it even happens in us. It's not always a very permanent record though. So in walruses, those scars are known to be long-lived. And so it is a pretty good indicator to see how many times a female ovulated over her lifespan. But for other species like harbor seals, they only last a few years. So it's kind of species specific, but we all develop those scars.
And a follow-up question to that was about the scars that you showed on the ovary that was cut open. It seemed like the scars that were more recent were bigger. So do the scars get smaller with time? Like, so the smaller ones are for older pregnancies?
Yes, absolutely. When they first form, it actually ruptures part of the ovary. And so it takes up a lot of space. that scar from ovulation when it's fresh, it can take up like a third of the ovary and be quite large. And then it just starts to shrink and reduce in size from there.
Great. And then Bob had a question about differences in the numbers of young walruses. And Tanya, I don't know whether when you were growing up, there were walruses around your community, or whether in your interviews you were able to talk to community members on St. Lawrence Island who could talk about that. But Bob was wondering whether there were any differences in the numbers of young walruses over time.
Sonia, did you have any answers to that one? Otherwise, I can take a stab at it.
I don't have any answers for it, but we did have walrus growing up, but I don't know about the question.
So from doing the interviews that Tony and I did together, which we'll talk about in just a moment, we did have hunters talk to us about that. And hunters are able to tell you from time to time if they notice in certain years that there are more females with calves, or they're noticing females are maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger producing calves. And the way that they're able to tell is by looking at their tusks. So hunters that have been spending a lot of time out there can estimate the age of that mother walrus just by looking at the tusk size. So there is a little bit of information about that from talking with community members.
Great, well, thank you. All right, well, maybe we should go on to the next, since we're talking about the interviews and subsistence, maybe we should go on to our next section and see what kind of information we have there.
That sounds good. I'm gonna hand it over to Sonia.
Yeah, so subsistence hunting. Many people in the Arctic, particularly indigenous people, depend on the ocean as a source of food, like marine mammals such as bowhead and beluga whales, walrus, and seals. Marine mammals are woven into Alaska Native and Arctic indigenous culture through food, spirituality, medicine, and social ties. Our hunting practices have been around for millennia, and absolutely nothing goes to waste. Our people have made boats, tools, clothing, artwork from the inedible parts of walrus and whales. Marine mammals are part of our ancient and sustainable relationship with the land and sea, and provide food and an important economic resource for hunters and artists in rural Alaska. And on the slides, sorry, it looks like some of the wording got cut out, but the middle you can see some seagull and duck eggs and some seal oil. In the bottom left corner, some salmon and some more foods. You can go to the next slide. Traditional knowledge from elders, hunters, and villagers gives us vital information for scientific research, like firsthand experience with climate change and concerns with subsistence hunted animals. Climate change in the Arctic is more rapid than any other biome in the world, with sea ice melting, rising sea levels, changes in snow cover, and ocean acidification affecting our polar waters. Many marine organisms heavily depend on the right sea temperature, and any disruption can influence members of the ecosystem, including indigenous people of the Arctic. And so in these slides, my brother is in the middle holding a beluga fluke. He does a lot of hunting in Nome with his girlfriend and some of our cousins. And in some of on the photos on the left, you can see them skinning. In the bottom one, my brother and his girlfriend are skinning a seal and preparing the fat for rendering into seal oil. And on the top right corner, my cousins had just taken off all the skin and blubber off of the beluga, also known as matok. which is a really good part of the whale. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So in the interviews, we interviewed a total of 24 St. Lawrence Island residents, and we found that walruses, seals, fish, and crabs were discussed as the top 4 main marine resources from Gambell and Sivunga community members. But these are also the animals that are undergoing most change according to informant knowledge. And why is that? Well, climate change, loss in sea ice, and bad weather have contributed to the reduced access and overall catch of walrus. This has increased hunting effort and raised concerns about walrus reproductive success without ice. As you heard from Janelle, that walruses do depend on sea ice to reproduce. With more bad weather occurring, hunters have reported having to travel further by boat than previous years and even traveling 80 to 100 miles in search of walrus. You can go to the next slide. So decreases in walrus catch are a major factor leading to food scarcity. A woman in Gambell in one of her interviews stated, 4 or 5 walruses, our meat racks would be full. Our freezers would be full. Right now, our meat racks are empty and our freezer barely has any. It doesn't take many of these large marine mammals to feed one family. This point illustrates that even harvesting a handful of walruses has become a challenge. St. Lawrence Island residents are responding to these environmental changes in a variety of ways. Like any other culture, St. Lawrence Island residents have cultural food preferences, but in times of need, these preferences are replaced with whatever foods are available. This strategy has been practiced historically and has allowed for the survival of our people when marine mammals were scarce. You can go to the next slide. So some cultural differences that I noticed when we traveled to St. Lawrence Island was particularly with food. So when I grew up, it was so common like to go to fish camp and make a bunch of dry fish. In the bottom left photo, you can see how the fish fillets are sliced and they're hung and dried, and that's how we store a lot of our salmon and like eat it through the winter. And when I went to the island, they knew what dry fish was, but they couldn't actually make it themselves, like in a really good way, like you could in Nome or the other villages, because the island wasn't like dry. You saw like it's a really stormy island, and it was just really hard to get the like right temperature outside to make dry fish. So like some foods they considered delicacies were a lot of fermented and dried foods, and they ate a lot of bowhead mutton. And when I went there, like it's really hard for our family to get bowhead whale, but it's really easy to get beluga. And so when I was talking to some of the residents, we started doing a trade. So like a gallon of dry fish for a gallon of matuk, and I was able to send some to my family. So that was really cool. And one other thing is a lot of the residents, the community members, they collected food from the beach, especially after a storm. Like sometimes they could go out and find, like some people talked about finding octopus legs or other seafoods that they usually don't get that are on the bottom of the ocean but came up during a storm. They had like a lot of ways of preparing food just from the beach. So that was just like really interesting to learn. And I wanted to end that with, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Tanya. Yeah, actually, Lori was wondering how the seal oil is used that you showed in your first slide.
It's used like a condiment. I really like eating it with dry fish or boiled salmon. Um, some people, it's also used as a medicine. So like if you're feeling cold or sick, you can take a teaspoon of it, and there's a lot of people will dip like vegetables too, fresh or boiled vegetables like boiled potatoes or seal oil is really good.
Great. Theodore had wanted to know what are the little orange things in the center of the slide where you have beach cast seafoods.
Yeah, that was a tunicate that Janelle and I found on the beach, and I think Janelle can go into more detail on what exactly that was.
Sure. Tunicates, it's an animal, and they're found washed up. And there's a few different varieties. They're colonial in this case, and yeah, it's a small animal. They are also called sea squirts. You might know them as that. And people love to eat them on St. Lawrence Island. They taste salty.
Great. Wow, that's really interesting. And I thought that it was interesting too that you were that there was that you were able to trade your dry fish for muktak. I hadn't thought about the fact that St. Lawrence Island is such a moist environment that it would be hard to dry fish. So
Yeah, because it's like what, a 30-minute plane ride from Nome, and you can make it perfectly in Nome. Like everyone makes it. It was so common when I started talking about it there. It was so funny because as soon as I traded with one person, other people started coming. They're like, I heard you have dry fish here. I was like, darn, not anymore.
great. We do have a couple more questions, but I know that you have another section to go through, Janelle. So I think what we might do is go through the next section and then we'll gather up any questions at the end.
Okay, that sounds good. So the third project we want to share with you today was a collaborative project that we did with the schools on St. Lawrence Island. And really this came about from some of the interview work that Tonya and I did. So while we were talking specifically to elders and grandparents, they often would mention that they would speak in Yupik to their grandchildren, and their grandkids would have no idea what they were saying. And so they were really concerned about losing their language, which was a really important part of losing their culture. I also learned at a community meeting that Savunga had stopped teaching the language program in their school for 25 years. And this resulted in a really large generational gap in the knowledge of the language. But fortunately, the community was really passionate about ensuring that the language was taught in the schools. The principal was very supportive of this, and 3 community members stepped forward and volunteered to teach the language in the school system. And so this seemed like a place that we could help. And so I'd really like to acknowledge your host, Lisa Haruki-Rearing, and Renee Moyak, who is from Savunga but lives here in Juneau. The 3 of us embarked on this project together. And then it wouldn't be possible for this language project to have happened, of course, without the support of the principal and the teachers at these schools. So thank you to Pitu and Lisa and Gaetano and Miriam for all of your help, and Jelaine as well, in getting this Yupik curriculum to the point where it is now. So you've heard me call it Yupik. It's specifically the language is St. Lawrence Island Yupik or Siberian Yupik. And in this map, you can see that it's shaded this blue color where St. Lawrence Island is. It's actually a different language than Central Yupik, but it's the same language that's spoken on Chukotka in Russia. And that makes sense. I mentioned that a lot of people have relatives on Chukotka, and that historically people would travel back and forth by boat. The last name that the language is known by is the traditional name that people on St. Lawrence Island call it by, and that's Akuzapik. So 3 different names, but 1 language. The first thing we wanted to do was see what the needs were for the schools when they were working on developing this language program. I mentioned that in Savoonga it had been taught in 25 years. In Gamble, they did actively continue to teach the language. And so Lisa and I were able to go travel in person. We went to Savoonga first, and that's where this picture is taken at the school there. And unfortunately, there was really bad weather while we were out there, and we weren't able to make it to Gamble. But we were able to sit in on multiple classrooms and learn about how the Yupik language is being taught in Savoonga. Of course, we don't speak the language, so we knew we weren't going to contribute to that aspect, but we thought we might be able to incorporate some biology into the lesson plans. We really thought we would be starting from scratch, but while we were there, we discovered that they actually had a curriculum that was developed in the 80s. And that had a lot of information about subsistence in it already, including learning about how to ID animals and talk about migrations. But many of the teachers told us that these lessons were outdated, some of the materials were missing, and it really needed to be revamped. And in some cases, the translations weren't correct. We targeted our efforts on making some additions to the 5th and 6th grades, and those grades focused on animal identification, animal migration, and they even talked about traditional foods. And so I don't know if any of you ever tried Eskimo ice cream. I'll let you guys put that in the chat and let me know if you've tried it.
If you've ever tried Eskimo ice cream, you can put. We do have some folks from Savoonga and Gamble on, so, and also from Kotzebue too. So if you have tried Eskimo ice cream, please put your answer in the question box. We do have some people who are saying no, they've never tried it and are curious to know what it is. But how about if you tell us what it is?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to make it, but the traditional recipe that we found on St. Lawrence Island was to use finely cut up reindeer meat, and reindeer are locally found on St. Lawrence Island, to mix that with reindeer tallow, which is the fat, to add seal oil, and then also add 1 cup of soft snow. Some of you may have had different variations that have included fish or berries.
And Catherine was saying she is Central Yupik, so her aktak is very different and not made with any reindeer at all. So that kind of backs up what you were talking about in that there's a lot of variability in how the dish is made in different regions.
Yeah, so this one is commonly made throughout Alaska, but like you said, Lisa, there's different variations. So I just wanted to share this one with you. And this was fun. A couple of the lessons focused on traditional foods and on recipes. So we designed that lesson so that kids would go home and they would talk to their grandparents and talk to their community elders and learn about recipes. And they put together a recipe book that included both historical recipes and also things that they make with their families currently that might be more current or include store-bought ingredients as well. I was also able to incorporate a lesson that talked about the reproductive biology of walruses, so I included some of that work from my research in the units. And one of the things that I had an artist do was create these big life-size fabric walruses. So just like in the English language in Akuzapik, they have different names for a male versus a female walrus, a calf or a juvenile. They even have names for walruses when their tusks come together and touch, or when there's a rogue walrus. And so by using these walrus models, the teachers could ask the students about what they call the whiskers in Akuzapik, or what they call the eyes or the tusks. And they are life-size, so we had a whole family made, a calf, a juvenile, a female, and a male. And you can see how big they are compared to my 65-pound dog. And then lastly, we also ensured that Akuzapik information was available for all different marine mammals that there were names for. And this was information that we got also from the interviews. And so this is really kind of interesting because having an Akuzapik name indicates that that animal has been seen around St. Lawrence Island for centuries. And so just as you would imagine, there's an Akusapiq name for belugas, for bowhead whales, and for killer whales, but there were also a few surprises for us. So there are Yupik names on St. Lawrence Island for sea otters and northern fur seals, which are occasionally seen there. Additionally, during our interviews, we had several hunters talk to us about seals that looked a lot like spotted seals, but they actually smelt and tasted different. And so it's quite likely that they were referring to harbor seals. Historically, harbor seals aren't known to come up into the Bering Sea. That's too far north for them. But the information that hunters shared with us indicates that it's quite likely that harbor seals are expanding their range and are starting to show up around St. Lawrence Island, even though we don't currently have a Yupik name for them that is used. We learned a lot of different lessons on the different projects that we conducted on St. Lawrence Island. And so in summary of today's talk, one of the things we learned was that walrus ovaries are a useful tool for scientists to look at, to help them understand how populations are responding to changes in their environment.
We also learned that climate change is impacting food security, making it more difficult for hunters to go out and catch walrus. St. Lawrence Island communities are resilient and adapt to change by eating alternative foods like we have historically done. And food is part of cultural identity, like how you guys have seen throughout the presentation.
And lastly, we know that language is a really important part of cultural identity as well. And these communities are ensuring that the skills that they learned with the Akusapiq language are going to be passed down to generations. I'd really like to thank and acknowledge all of the hunters, the school teachers, the principals, and the community members that made all of this work possible. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with me, at times sharing your food with me, and just sharing good times together. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge all of my partners and the many funding sources I had for these different projects. And with that, we'd like to take any remaining questions.
Okay, yeah, we have just a few more minutes for questions, but that was very interesting, and thank you for sharing all that information with us. We did have a couple of questions about whether you both were able to try some traditional foods when you were on St. Lawrence Island. Tonya, you were saying that there were alternative foods. I was wondering whether you had been able to try any of the beach cast alternatives that they had to walrus.
Unfortunately, I didn't, but the interviews were also, I feel like if we were inside other people's homes, they would offer it, but I didn't, besides the food that I traded for.
Well, I was there across different times. I have tried different food. I had an opportunity to try walrus. I've also tried polar bear and fry bread in people's homes when I was going and talking to hunters and boat captains. I will say that I didn't enjoy the polar bear very much.
Was that because of the taste or?
Yeah, so they have to boil it. Polar bear are prone to having what's called trichinosis, which is this worm that you can get from eating the meat if it isn't cooked really thoroughly. So they boil it and barbecue it. And even after doing that, I've done a lot of necropsies in my work, which is basically an autopsy when you cut open a dead animal. And to me, the polar bear tasted a lot like cutting open a dead seal. So it's funny, it kind of sounds like reverse of maybe Tonia's experience of like going to an aquarium, and mine was kind of like, ooh, this tastes like cutting open a dead animal.
Well, thank you so much. We're just about at time here, so thank you very much for sharing your information with us. And I was wondering whether you might have one parting piece of advice for any students who might be interested in following your footsteps and maybe going into science or going into art.
Sure, I'll go first perhaps, and then let Tonia talk. If you're interested in going into science, I think don't be afraid to seek opportunities to enroll in an internship, do a volunteer program for a summer. If you're really interested in the work that a teacher is doing, don't be afraid to go knock on their door, show up in their office hours and ask them how to get involved. That's really how I got my start, was just by showing an interest. So if you're interested, go ahead and be curious and go look for those opportunities.
Yeah, advice that I have to offer for students who are interested in science is like, do not be afraid to take advantage of all of the undergraduate opportunities that are available, because after you graduate, it's really hard to get like that research experience that you really want to get and know what you really want to do in the field. I can't tell you how many programs I wanted to apply to that were just available to me because I was still in school. But yeah, they are out there, and your teachers and professors are more than happy to talk to you. It's just a matter of asking them and showing your interest.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us, and we're getting a lot of thank yous from the audience. So, so thank you again. And for our audience members, we will have a recording of this webinar up on our NOAA Live Alaska website. So if you are on, I will send it to you. And also, we will be starting our series on the Northwest Arctic Borough next week with my colleague Mabel Baldwin Schaefer. So please tune in again next week. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Tonia. And thank you to our audience. Bye-bye.